Somewhere in a lab right now, a machine is reading someone's spit. A few weeks later, they'll open an app and see a number they didn't expect, 2% Neanderthal. Not a metaphor, not a joke. An actual measurable slice of their genome, inherited from a species that vanished from the Earth around 40,000 years ago. If you have European or Asian ancestry, you almost certainly carry that same ghost sequence, sitting quietly inside every cell in your body. Here's what makes that strange. Neanderthals weren't some failed evolutionary experiment. They survived brutal ice ages in Europe for over 300,000 years, longer than our own species has existed. They had brains as large as ours, sometimes larger. They made tools, controlled fire, cared for their sick, and buried their dead. By almost any measure, they were not the stumbling brutes of old textbook drawings. The evidence for that is oddly touching. At a site called La Chapelle aux Saints in France, archaeologists found the skeleton of an elderly Neanderthal man, his spine curved with arthritis, most of his teeth lost years before he died, one hip badly damaged. He couldn't have hunted, chewed tough meat, or kept up with a moving group on his own. Someone fed him, someone slowed down for him. In Shanidar Cave in Iraq, another Neanderthal, missing an arm and blind in one eye, survived for years after injuries that should have killed him instantly without sustained help from the people around him. These weren't animals running on instinct. They were a society that looked after its own. And then in the span of a few thousand years after modern humans arrived in Europe, they were gone. So here's the real question. If Neanderthals were strong, smart, and perfectly adapted to their world, why are you here and they're not? Deep inside Bruniquel Cave in southern France, 300 meters from the entrance, in total darkness, archaeologists found something that shouldn't have been there. Broken stalagmites arranged deliberately into rings, some showing traces of fire. The layer dates to roughly 176,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years before modern humans ever set foot in Europe. Building that meant carrying fire deep underground, coordinating a group in the dark, and choosing to shape space for a reason nobody can fully explain. Whatever else Neanderthals were, they weren't simple. Start with the world they were built for. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthal life was tuned to one strategy: hunt large animals up close with raw physical power. Their bones tell the story before any historian does. Neanderthal skeletons show injury patterns that match modern rodeo athletes: fractured ribs, broken arms, healed skull trauma, the signature of hunters who walked directly up to a wounded bison or woolly rhino and drove a spear into it by hand. It worked for a very long time in a world full of large, slow-moving prey. But around 50,000 years ago, the climate started swinging harder and faster than it had in millennia. Ice core records show a string of abrupt cold snaps known as Heinrich events, each one capable of collapsing local ecosystems within a human lifetime. Herds that Neanderthal groups depended on shrank, migrated, or vanished from entire regions for years at a time. A hunting strategy built around one type of prey, in one type of landscape, doesn't bend easily when the landscape itself stops cooperating. Modern humans arriving from Africa carried something different: flexibility. Sapiens' diets included fish, shellfish, birds, small game, wild grains, and roots, alongside big game when it was available. When one food source disappeared, there were 3 or 4 others to fall back on. It's a small difference on paper. Over 10,000 years of climate chaos, it's the difference between a population that bends and one that breaks. Then there's the question of who you can call for help. Archaeologists have found sapiens' campsites with shell jewelry, decorated tools, and raw materials like obsidian and flint that originated hundreds of kilometers away, sometimes crossing several distinct territories to get there. Physical proof of trade and contact between distant groups who had never even met face to face. That's not just economics, it's a survival network. When a local group's hunting grounds failed one season, they had somewhere to go, someone to lean on, genetic and cultural exchange keeping populations connected and resilient. Neanderthal sites show almost none of this. Their tool materials are almost always local, sourced within a few kilometers. Genetic studies of Neanderthal remains reveal something sobering: signs of inbreeding, low genetic diversity, small isolated communities that likely rarely met their neighbors at all. It's the difference between a species living in a handful of scattered, closed rooms and one quietly building a continent-wide network of open doors. Technology tells a similar story. Neanderthal weapons, like the wooden thrusting spears found at Schörningen in Germany, were built for close-range power, not distance. By the time modern humans reached Europe, some groups were using spear throwers, a lever called an atlatl that could hurl a dart with far more force and range than a human arm alone, and eventually early bow-like weapons. That's the difference between killing an animal at arm's length and killing it from 30 feet away. Safer hunting means fewer crippling injuries, fewer hunters lost in their prime, more people alive long enough to raise the next generation. Small advantages like this don't win a single battle. They win a 1,000-year war of attrition, one slightly better odds decision at a time. And then there's simple math. Genetic evidence suggests the entire Neanderthal population across Europe and Western Asia may have numbered only in the tens of thousands at any given time, scattered across an enormous range, in small, disconnected bands, sometimes just a few dozen individuals per group. Modern human populations arriving from Africa, by contrast, are estimated to have grown into the low hundreds of thousands within a few thousand years of entering the same territory. Small populations are fragile in a very unglamorous way. A bad decade of hunting, a disease outbreak, a run of harsh winters, the kind of setback a large, connected population absorbs and recovers from, can be enough to quietly erase a small, isolated one. No single dramatic event required. Just bad luck repeated often enough, with no cushion left to absorb it. This wasn't a distant, separate story either. The two species were living on top of each other. At Mandrin Cave in southern France, archaeologists found modern human tools in a layer sandwiched between two layers of Neanderthal occupation, dated to around 54,000 years ago, proof that sapiens and Neanderthals moved in and out of the exact same shelter, possibly within a single human generation of each other. Across Europe, the two species weren't living in separate worlds slowly drifting apart. They were competing for the same caves, the same rivers, the same herds, sometimes only years or decades apart, for thousands of years. And competition like that carries a hidden risk that has nothing to do with strength or intelligence: disease. When previously separated populations meet, they carry different immune histories, different pathogens their bodies have never had to fight before. It's the same brutal pattern that would repeat tens of thousands of years later, when European diseases devastated indigenous populations in the Americas who had no prior exposure. A small, already isolated Neanderthal population meeting a species carrying an unfamiliar disease load didn't need a war to lose ground. Sometimes contact alone was enough. By this point, Neanderthal territory had been shrinking for thousands of years, pushed toward the edges of the map. One of the last known strongholds was Goram's Cave, a sea-facing shelter at the southern tip of Gibraltar, where evidence suggests small groups may have held on until roughly 40,000 years ago, a final foothold at the very edge of a continent they had once ruled entirely. If there was a final push, evidence points to a brutal one. Around 39,000 years ago, a massive volcanic eruption near modern-day Naples, the Campanian Ignimbrite eruption, one of the largest in Europe in the last 200,000 years, buried huge stretches of the continent in ash and triggered a sharp, sudden cooling. For scattered Neanderthal populations already stretched thin, already isolated, already losing ground, it may have been the shove that finished what climate, competition, and disease had already started. But here's the twist that makes this story more complicated and more human than a simple extinction. Neanderthals didn't just disappear. In many places before the end, they met modern humans arriving into their territory, and they interbred. Every non-African human today carries somewhere between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA, inherited from those encounters, tens of thousands of years ago. Some of it still matters. Neanderthal-derived genes are linked to immune responses, skin and hair traits, even how some people's bodies respond to cold. Adaptations Neanderthals spent 300,000 years perfecting for a world modern humans were still learning to survive. So the honest answer to why Neanderthals disappeared isn't one clean cause. It's a slow accumulation of small disadvantages: a narrower diet, smaller and more isolated communities, riskier hunting methods, a population too small to absorb repeated bad luck, compounding for thousands of years, until a changing climate and a catastrophic eruption ran out the clock on a species that had already survived almost everything else the Ice Age could throw at it. There's a broader lesson sitting inside this story, one that has nothing to do with brain size or brute strength. Every advantage that mattered here was about connection: a wider diet instead of one locked-in food source, a trade network instead of a closed group, a weapon that let people survive their own mistakes instead of paying for them with their lives. Neanderthals weren't beaten because they were weaker. They were beaten because they were, in almost every sense, more isolated in a world that was starting to reward the species willing to stay connected. Which brings us back to that DNA test. 2% Neanderthal isn't a footnote. It's the surviving edge of an entire species, carried forward inside the one that outcompeted them. Neanderthals didn't just lose. Pieces of them walked forward with us, into agriculture, into cities, into every mirror you've ever looked into. In the end, the species that vanished didn't disappear completely. It just stopped being separate from us.